The summer heat of 53 BCE bore down mercilessly on the eastern frontier of the Roman Republic, in the dusty garrison town of Carrhae, located near what is now the modern Turkish city of Harran in the southeastern reaches of Anatolia. A massive military force prepared for what its commander believed would be a campaign of legendary proportions. Marcus Licinius Crassus, at 60 years of age, stood among his 7 legions, approximately 42,000 battle-hardened Roman soldiers, and contemplated the glory that awaited him across the Mesopotamian plains. Crassus was no ordinary Roman citizen seeking fortune in distant lands. He was one of the 3 men who effectively ruled the known world. A member of the first triumvirate alongside Julius Caesar and Gnaeus Pompey Magnus. While Caesar had conquered Gaul and Pompey had subdued the pirates of the Mediterranean and reorganized the East, Crassus remained the financier, the businessman, the man known more for his wealth than his martial prowess. This reality gnawed at him with the persistence of an unhealed wound. At an age when most men contemplated retirement and the pleasures of grandchildren, Crassus burned with an ambition that younger men might have found excessive, even dangerous. The historical record preserved by Plutarch in his Life of Crassus provides us with intimate details of this moment in history. Plutarch, writing over a century after these events, drew upon contemporary accounts and official Roman records to paint a portrait of a man consumed by the need to prove himself worthy of standing beside his fellow triumvirs. Crassus had accumulated a fortune estimated at over 200 million sestertii, enough to fund entire armies through real estate speculation during Rome's civil wars, particularly by purchasing properties at fire sale prices during Sulla's proscriptions. He had raised a private fire brigade that would only extinguish blazes after purchasing the burning property at a fraction of its value. He had trained gladiators and leased them out for profit. He had become synonymous with wealth itself. Romans spoke of being as rich as Crassus, the way later generations would speak of being rich as Croesus. But wealth without military glory was incomplete in Roman society. The dignitas of a Roman nobleman required not just fortune, but also the respect earned through command in battle, through triumph, through conquest. Caesar had his Gallic victories, his crossing of the Rhine, his expedition to Britain. Pompey had earned the honorific Magnus the Great for his campaigns in the East, his defeat of Mithridates VI of Pontus, his reorganization of Syria and Judea. What did Crassus have? The suppression of Spartacus's slave revolt. A victory diminished in the public imagination, because it had been achieved against slaves rather than foreign enemies. And even that triumph had been tarnished when Pompey had swooped in to claim credit for the final mop-up operations. The Parthian Empire beckoned like a siren song, stretching from the Euphrates to the borders of India. The Parthian realm represented the successor to the once mighty Persian Empire. Its capital at Ctesiphon gleamed with wealth, accumulated through control of the Silk Road trade routes. Stories circulated in Rome of cities whose walls were decorated with gold leaf, of treasuries overflowing with precious stones, of riches that would make even Crassus's substantial fortune seem modest by comparison. Moreover, the Parthians had recently been embroiled in internal succession disputes. To a Roman strategist, this suggested weakness, vulnerability, an opportunity for intervention that would be both profitable and glorious. Crassus had spent months planning this expedition. He had used his position as proconsul of Syria, granted to him as part of the triumvir's division of the Roman world, to assemble his force. 7 full legions represented an enormous commitment of Roman military power, approximately 42,000 legionaries, plus an equivalent number of auxiliary troops, cavalry, and support personnel. The logistics alone were staggering: the supply trains, the siege equipment, the provisions needed to sustain such a force in hostile territory. Crassus had invested not just Rome's resources, but his own personal fortune into this venture, confident that the returns would justify the expenditure many times over. Yet from the very beginning, warnings emerged from multiple quarters. The king of Armenia, Artavasdes II, had offered an alternative route for the invasion. Rather than marching directly across the arid plains of Mesopotamia, Artavasdes proposed that the Roman army move through Armenian territory, where his own forces would join them. This northern route would provide better access to water and provisions, would avoid the most difficult terrain, and would give the Romans the advantage of Armenian cavalry troops already familiar with Parthian tactics. Artavasdes made his case personally to Crassus in the spring of 53 BCE, meeting with the proconsul in northern Syria. Plutarch records that Crassus listened politely but dismissed the advice. The Armenian route would take longer, would require sharing any potential glory with Armenian allies, and most importantly, would acknowledge that Crassus needed assistance to achieve his goal. For a man determined to prove himself the military equal of Caesar and Pompey, accepting such help was intolerable. He would march directly across Mesopotamia, through Parthian client territories, demonstrating Roman power so overwhelming that cities would open their gates without resistance. The directness of the route appealed to his methodical business mind. Why take the long way when the short route was available? Other warnings came from within Roman circles. Gaius Cassius Longinus, one of Crassus's quaestors, had experience in the region and understood the challenges of desert warfare. Cassius cautioned that the Parthian military system was fundamentally different from any enemy Rome had previously encountered. Unlike the infantry-heavy armies of Greece, Macedonia, or even the Germanic tribes that Caesar was battling in Gaul, the Parthians built their military power around cavalry, both heavy cataphract lancers encased in armor and highly mobile horse archers. These forces could operate in terrain where Roman infantry would struggle, could attack and retreat before the legions could bring their superior close combat skills to bear. Crassus's response to these concerns reveals much about his character and his fatal blind spots. According to Plutarch's account, supplemented by the later writings of Cassius Dio, Crassus believed that Roman discipline and tactical superiority would overcome any challenges posed by unfamiliar enemies or difficult terrain. The Roman legion had conquered the Mediterranean world through its unmatched organization, its engineering capabilities, its iron discipline in battle. The testudo formation could defend against arrows. The pilum could break enemy charges. The gladius had proven decisive in countless close-quarters engagements. Why should Parthian cavalry prove any different from the countless other cavalry forces that had broken against the Roman military machine? Moreover, Crassus harbored a businessman's confidence in his own judgment. He had made his fortune by seeing opportunities that others missed, by acting decisively when others hesitated, by trusting his own analysis over the conventional wisdom. This same confidence that had built his financial empire now guided his military decision-making. If the Armenian king suggested one route, perhaps that was because Artavasdes wanted to control the campaign's direction, to position himself as indispensable to Roman success. If Cassius worried about Parthian tactics, perhaps the young officer simply lacked the vision to see how Roman methods could adapt to new challenges. The ancient sources also hint at another factor driving Crassus's urgency: time. At 60 years old, he understood that this might be his last opportunity for military glory. The triumvirate itself showed signs of strain. Caesar and Pompey's interests increasingly diverged, and Crassus served as the crucial balancing force between them. But how long could such a balance last? If he delayed, if he spent another year in careful preparation, the political situation might change. Caesar might score new victories in Gaul that would further eclipse any achievements in the East. Pompey might find new avenues for expanding his own glory. The window of opportunity might close before Crassus could thrust his hand through it. So in the early summer of 53 BCE, as temperatures climbed and the Mesopotamian sun beat down on bronze helmets and iron armor, Crassus gave the order to march. The 7 legions, the I, 3, 7, 8, X, and 12, if we follow the most probable identifications from fragmentary records assembled in their centuries and cohorts. The aquilifer of each legion raised the silver eagle standard, the most sacred symbol of Roman military power. The centurions barked orders, the ranks dressed their line, and 42,000 pairs of hobnailed sandals began their journey eastward across the Euphrates River. The crossing itself took several days, a massive logistical undertaking, requiring the construction of pontoon bridges and the ferrying of equipment across the broad, slow-moving river. From the eastern bank, the army could see the beginning of the Mesopotamian plains stretching toward the horizon, flat, arid land, broken by occasional wadis and low hills. The nearest significant objective was the city of Carrhae, about 50 miles east of the Euphrates, serving as a strategic hub controlling routes through northern Mesopotamia. As the columns marched eastward, local scouts and guides brought reports of Parthian movements. A Parthian force was assembling under the command of a general named Serena, a young nobleman from one of the empire's great aristocratic families. Initial estimates suggested his force was substantial but not overwhelming, perhaps 10,000 cavalry. Crassus, commanding 42,000 legionaries plus auxiliaries, saw no reason for concern. The Romans had defeated larger forces before. Cavalry without infantry support had historically proven vulnerable to disciplined heavy infantry. The tactical calculus, as Crassus understood it, favored Rome decisively. What Crassus could not fully appreciate, what none of the Romans truly understood, as they marched deeper into Mesopotamia, was that they were walking into a carefully prepared trap, facing an enemy who had studied Roman methods and developed tactics specifically designed to negate Roman advantages. The Parthian Empire had fought Rome before in border skirmishes and smaller engagements. Serena and his commanders understood that meeting Roman legions in direct infantry combat was suicide. But they also understood something else, that Roman tactical doctrine, evolved through centuries of Mediterranean warfare, had never faced an enemy quite like the Parthian cavalry armies of the East. The stage was set. An ambitious Roman proconsul, burning with the need to prove himself, leading 7 legions deep into unfamiliar territory. A confident Parthian general, younger than Crassus by decades, commanding mobile forces perfectly adapted to the terrain. And between them, the dusty plains near Carrhae, where these two military systems would collide with catastrophic results for Rome. Plutarch, writing long after these events, captured something essential about this moment. Crassus marched east not out of careful strategic calculation, but out of ambition that had curdled into desperation, not from strength but from a profound insecurity about his place in history. For a man of 45 or older, reading this account across the millennia, there is perhaps uncomfortable recognition, the understanding of how ambition can blind us to obvious dangers, how the need to prove ourselves can drive us toward decisions we might otherwise recognize as foolish, how time's passage can make us reckless rather than cautious. Crassus's tragedy began not on the battlefield at Carrhae, but in his own heart, in that burning need to be remembered not just as the richest man in Rome but as one of its greatest commanders. That ambition, more than any Parthian arrow, would doom him and the 42,000 men who followed him into the desert. The morning of the battle dawned hot and cloudless over the plains near Carrhae in the early summer of 53 BCE. The Roman army had been marching for days through increasingly arid terrain, and the soldiers were already exhausted before the first arrow flew. Marcus Licinius Crassus had pushed his legions hard, driven by the intelligence reports that suggested a Parthian force was nearby smaller than his own army. According to his scouts, and therefore vulnerable to a decisive engagement that would break Parthian resistance and open the road to Ctesiphon. The location where the two armies would meet was a flat, featureless expanse of sun-baked earth stretching in every direction. Unlike the forests of Gaul where Caesar's legions fought, or the mountainous terrain of Greece and Macedonia, where Roman tactical doctrine had been refined through countless battles, this landscape offered no natural features that infantry could use for protection or advantage. No hills to anchor a flank, no rivers to secure a position, no trees to break cavalry charges. Just open ground under a merciless sky, with visibility extending for miles in every direction. Plutarch's account, drawn from survivors' testimonies and official reports that somehow made their way back to Rome, provides the most detailed narrative of what transpired. As the Roman army deployed for battle in the early hours, organizing itself into the traditional formation that had conquered the Mediterranean world, the first signs of the Parthian force appeared on the horizon. What the Romans saw initially seemed to confirm Crassus's optimistic assessment: cavalry units, perhaps 10,000 strong, moving in loose formation across the plains. No massed infantry blocks, no siege equipment, no apparent supply train, just horsemen who seemed almost insignificant against the weight of 7 Roman legions. Crassus ordered his army into a defensive formation that had proven effective in countless previous engagements. The legions formed a massive hollow square, with infantry facing outward on all sides, cavalry tucked into the corners, and the baggage train protected in the center. This formation was designed to present an unbreakable wall of shields and spears in every direction, preventing any enemy from exploiting a vulnerable flank or rear. Each face of the square stretched for hundreds of yards, composed of multiple cohorts standing in their traditional 3-line formation. Hastati in front, Principes behind them, and the veteran triarii forming the final reserve line. The Roman soldiers, professional warriors who had trained for years in their craft, took their positions with the mechanical precision that Roman military culture demanded. They locked their large rectangular shields, the scutum, into overlapping walls. They readied their heavy javelins, the pilum, designed to punch through armor and disable enemy shields. They loosened their short swords, the gladius, in their scabbards, the weapon that had proven decisive in close combat from Spain to Syria. If the Parthians wanted a battle, Rome would give them one, and the legions would demonstrate why Roman infantry remained unmatched in the ancient world. But as Cassius Dio records in his later history, the Parthian commander Surena had no intention of fighting the kind of battle the Romans expected. Surena was in his early 30s, a member of the Suren family, one of the 7 great aristocratic houses of Parthia entitled to crown the king. He commanded not just warriors but a carefully orchestrated military instrument designed specifically to defeat enemies like Rome. His force, while smaller in total numbers, possessed capabilities that Roman tactical doctrine had never seriously encountered. The Parthian army that approached the Roman square consisted of 2 distinct but complementary elements. The first was the cataphracts heavy cavalry, whose horses and riders were both encased in scale armor, wielding long lances called contos. These warriors represented the Parthian equivalent of a breakthrough force, capable of smashing through infantry lines in a concentrated charge. But they were not Surena's primary weapon on this day. That distinction belonged to the second element, the horse archers. The Parthian horse archers were perhaps the most sophisticated light cavalry force in the ancient world. Mounted on swift, agile horses bred specifically for endurance in arid climates, these warriors had trained from childhood in the art of mounted archery. Unlike heavy cavalry that needed to close with the enemy, or infantry archers who had to remain stationary to shoot effectively, the horse archers could maintain a constant state of motion while raining arrows down on their opponents. They could circle an enemy formation at ranges where Roman javelins were useless, could retreat faster than infantry could advance, and could maintain this harassment for hours without respite. Most importantly, the Parthians had solved a problem that usually limited the effectiveness of archer units' ammunition supply. Serena had brought with him a massive supply train of camels, each loaded with thousands of arrows. As long as the supply train remained intact, his horse archers could shoot continuously without fear of exhausting their missiles. This single logistical innovation transformed the tactical situation entirely. The Romans, expecting a brief, decisive engagement that would end in close combat, found themselves facing an enemy who could attack indefinitely from beyond retaliation range. The battle began not with a dramatic charge but with a strange, unsettling sound. The Parthian force deployed a psychological weapon that Plutarch describes in detail: war drums made from stretched hides over bronze frames, beaten in coordinated rhythm to create a deep, resonant pounding that carried across the plains. The sound was unlike anything the Roman soldiers had heard before, not the war cries of Celtic warriors or the battle songs of Germanic tribes, but an inhuman, mechanical beating that seemed to come from everywhere at once. For men who had fought in forests and mountains where sound was muffled and broken by terrain, this open plain acoustics created a disorienting, demoralizing effect even before the first arrow flew. Then the arrows began. The horse archers approached the Roman square from all sides, staying at ranges between 100 and 200 yards, close enough for their powerful composite bows to be effective, far enough that Roman javelins fell harmlessly short. The arrows came not in massed volleys like those of Greek or Persian infantry archers, but in a continuous, relentless stream. Each archer worked independently, shooting as rapidly as his skill allowed, then retreating to the supply camels to refill his quiver before returning to the fight. The Romans raised their shields, forming the testudo, the famous tortoise formation, where shields locked overhead and on all sides to create a mobile armored shell. This formation had protected Roman soldiers against arrow fire in countless previous battles. But those battles had involved relatively brief exchanges of missiles before closing to hand-to-hand combat. Against the Parthian system, the testudo became a trap. The soldiers could protect themselves from arrows, but they could not advance effectively while maintaining the formation. And they could not stand motionless indefinitely under the psychological and physical strain of continuous bombardment. Plutarch records that Crassus initially believed the arrow's storm would exhaust itself quickly. He expected the Parthians would run out of ammunition or tire of shooting at targets they could not decisively harm, then withdraw or attempt a charge that would finally bring them within reach of Roman weapons. But hours passed, and the arrows continued without slackening. The horse archers rotated in and out, fresh warriors replacing tired ones, all supplied from the seemingly endless ammunition stores carried by the camel train. The casualties mounted with agonizing slowness. Arrows found gaps between shields. Soldiers grew tired and their guards slipped. The heavy armor that Romans wore for close combat became a liability under the desert sun. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion inside their protective shells. The wounded could not be properly treated because any break in the shield wall exposed soldiers to immediate harm. The dead could not be removed but piled up inside the formation, creating obstacles and further degrading unit cohesion. Crassus made the decision that military commanders have faced throughout history when defensive tactics prove insufficient. He ordered a counterattack. His son, Publius Licinius Crassus, led a force of roughly 5,000 men, a mixture of Gallic cavalry that had served with Julius Caesar, Roman auxiliary troops, and select legionaries in a charge designed to drive away the horse archers and reach the Parthian supply train. If they could destroy or capture the ammunition camels, the arrow storm would end and the battle could be decided on Roman terms. Publius's force broke from the main square and charged toward a segment of the Parthian line. The horse archers immediately retreated before them, exactly as Roman tactical doctrine predicted light cavalry would do when faced with a determined charge. Plutarch describes how Publius and his men pursued with growing confidence, believing they had finally found the key to breaking the enemy formation. The younger Crassus, eager to prove his own valor and justify his father's faith in him, pressed the pursuit harder and harder, driving the Parthians back across the plain. But it was a ruse, one of the oldest and most effective cavalry tactics, the feigned retreat. The Parthians withdrew in apparent disorder, drawing Publius's force further and further from the main Roman army. When the gap had widened to several miles, far enough that the two Roman forces could no longer support each other, the Parthians turned. The horse archers who had been fleeing suddenly wheeled their mounts and began shooting again. But now they were joined by the cataphracts, who had been held in reserve specifically for this moment. The armored lancers crashed into Publius's force like a metal avalanche. The Gallic cavalry, excellent warriors in their own right, found themselves overmatched by the heavier Parthian cataphracts. The Roman infantry cohorts tried to form defensive positions, but they were isolated in open terrain, surrounded by enemies who could attack from all sides simultaneously. The horse archers circled the trapped force, shooting into it from every angle, while the cataphracts repeatedly charged any position that seemed capable of organized resistance. Cassius Dio records that Publius fought with desperate courage, but the tactical situation was hopeless. His force was destroyed almost to the last man over the course of several hours. Publius himself, wounded by multiple arrows and seeing that escape was impossible, ordered his shield-bearer to kill him rather than allow him to be captured. The Parthians decapitated his corpse and mounted his head on a spear, a trophy that would soon serve a further psychological purpose. Back at the main Roman square, Marcus Licinius Crassus had no immediate knowledge of his son's fate. He waited for hours, hoping to see Publius return victorious or at least see evidence that the Parthian ammunition supply had been disrupted. Instead, the arrow storm continued unabated, and as the sun climbed toward its zenith, the heat became nearly unbearable. Soldiers collapsed inside their armor. The wounded groaned for water that could not be spared. The formation, which had started the day crisp and organized, began to sag with exhaustion and despair. Then the Parthians approached the Roman square again. And this time they brought Publius's head, displaying it prominently where Marcus Crassus and his officers could see it clearly. Plutarch describes this as the moment when the Roman commander's psychological collapse began. The death of his son, the failure of the counterattack, the endless continuation of the arrow bombardment, all of these combined to break Crassus's will. The man who had started the campaign brimming with confidence and ambition now faced the complete destruction of his strategy and the likelihood of total disaster. As afternoon turned to evening, Crassus made his final critical error. Rather than maintain the square and attempt an organized retreat under cover of darkness, he ordered a general withdrawal toward Carrhae. The formation dissolved into columns, trying to move quickly across open ground while still under attack. Cohesion broke down. Units became separated. The Parthians, sensing the Roman collapse, intensified their attacks. targeting the gaps that appeared as the organized formation fell apart into increasingly desperate clusters of soldiers trying to fight their way to safety. Cassius Dio recounts that some units maintained enough discipline to conduct a fighting retreat. But many others simply broke and ran, throwing down their heavy shields and armor in a futile attempt to escape faster. The Parthian cavalry, more mobile in every respect, hunted down these fleeing soldiers with methodical efficiency. The plains near Carrhae became a killing ground stretching for miles, littered with Roman dead and dying. Crassus himself did not survive the day. Accounts vary on the exact circumstances of his death, but Plutarch offers the most detailed version in the chaos of the retreat. Crassus and a group of officers were cut off from the main force. The Parthians approached under a flag of truce, offering to negotiate terms for the survivors' surrender. Whether Crassus actually believed they would honor such terms, or whether he simply saw no other option, he approached for the parley. In the confusion of the meeting, accounts suggest it was deliberately provoked by the Parthians. Violence erupted and Crassus was killed, either deliberately murdered or caught in the melee. By nightfall, the Battle of Carrhae was over. Of the approximately 42,000 Roman legionaries who had marched confidently toward glory just days earlier, roughly 20,000 lay dead on the Mesopotamian plains. Another 10,000 had been captured, many of them wounded and all of them facing an uncertain fate in Parthian captivity. Only about 12,000 managed to escape back toward Roman territory. Many of them wounded, all of them traumatized by one of the most complete military disasters in Roman history. For a man of 45 or more, reading this account across the gulf of 2 millennia, there is perhaps a recognition that cuts deeper than mere historical interest. Crassus's tragedy at Carrhae reflects a universal truth about ambition, pride, and the refusal to adapt to circumstances beyond our experience. He faced an enemy unlike any he had conceptually prepared for, in terrain that negated every advantage his forces possessed, and rather than adapt his strategy, he clung to the methods that had always worked before. His age and experience, which should have given him wisdom, instead locked him into rigid thinking. His need to prove himself drove him to dismiss advice from those who knew better. The hollow square formation, the testudo tactics, the assumption that Roman methods would prevail all represented not strength, but an inability to see beyond the patterns of past success. The sun set over Carrhae on a field of Roman dead, on the corpse of a man who had sought glory, and found only catastrophe, on the beginning of a mystery that would resonate through history. What would happen to those 10,000 captured survivors? That question would haunt Roman historians for generations and create legends that would echo across continents and centuries. The aftermath of the Battle of Carrhae stretched across the blood-soaked plains of Mesopotamia like a grotesque tableau that would haunt Roman consciousness for generations. In the days and weeks following that catastrophic June day in 53 BCE, as the Parthian forces under Serena methodically collected their victory's fruits, the scope of Rome's disaster became painfully clear. The bodies of 20,000 Roman soldiers lay scattered across miles of arid landscape, their armor stripped away by Parthian scavengers, their flesh already being consumed by the vultures and wild dogs that haunted battlefields throughout the ancient world. But perhaps more disturbing than the dead were the living approximately 10,000 Roman legionaries who found themselves prisoners of an enemy whose language they did not speak, whose customs they did not understand, and whose territory lay thousands of miles from anything they could call home. Plutarch's account, compiled from fragmentary reports and survivor testimonies that trickled back to Rome over subsequent years, describes the immediate aftermath with clinical precision. The captured Romans were rounded up in groups, stripped of their remaining weapons and armor, and placed under guard by Parthian cavalry units. who watched them with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. These were professional soldiers who had marched east with dreams of conquest and enrichment, who had believed themselves members of the world's most formidable military machine. Now they stood disarmed and defeated, exhausted from battle and dehydrated from the desert heat, confronting the reality that they would likely never see Rome again. The Parthian treatment of prisoners in this period reflected a complex set of political and economic calculations. Unlike the Romans, who often enslaved defeated enemies or forced them into gladiatorial combat for public entertainment, the Parthians viewed captured soldiers as potential assets to be deployed strategically. The Parthian Empire, stretching from the Euphrates River to the borders of India and from the Caucasus Mountains to the Persian Gulf, maintained a constant need for military manpower to garrison its extensive frontiers. Foreign soldiers, particularly those with Roman training and discipline, represented valuable resources that could be exploited for the empire's benefit. Cassius Dio, writing in the 3rd century CE with access to records now lost to us, provides additional details about the fate of these prisoners. He records that in the immediate aftermath of the battle, the Parthians conducted a brutal series of executions targeting Roman officers and anyone suspected of belonging to the equestrian or senatorial classes. These high-status prisoners represented potential diplomatic complications. Rome might demand their return, or they might serve as focal points for rescue attempts or prisoner exchanges. By eliminating them quickly, the Parthians simplified their logistical and political situation, while also sending a clear message about the consequences of Roman aggression. The common soldiers, however, faced a different fate. These men, legionaries drawn from Italy and the provinces, auxiliary troops from allied territories, support personnel who had accompanied the legions, eastward, possessed military skills that the Parthians valued but lacked the political significance that made them dangerous to keep alive. Over the weeks following Carrhae, these prisoners were organized into marching columns and moved eastward, deeper into Parthian territory, further from any possibility of Roman rescue or escape. The journey itself must have been a nightmare. The captured Romans, already exhausted from battle and traumatized by defeat, were force-marched across hundreds of miles of terrain that grew progressively more alien and hostile. From the relatively familiar landscapes of Mesopotamia, they were driven toward the Iranian plateau, through regions where the very geography seemed hostile to human habitation. The summer heat was relentless. Water was scarce and rationed strictly by their captors. Those who collapsed from exhaustion or injury were left behind, whether they were killed outright or simply abandoned to die in the desert. The ancient sources do not clearly specify, though the practical result was the same. Plutarch mentions that some prisoners attempted escape during these marches, but the odds against success were astronomical. Even if a man could slip away from his guards at night, where would he go? The nearest Roman territory lay hundreds of miles to the west, across deserts and mountains, through lands controlled by peoples who were either hostile to Rome or allied with Parthia. Without weapons, without supplies, without knowledge of the terrain or language, an escaped prisoner faced almost certain death from exposure, starvation, or recapture. The few who tried were typically caught within days and executed as examples to discourage further attempts. The historical record becomes frustratingly vague about what happened to these prisoners once they reached their final destinations within the Parthian Empire. This vagueness reflects a fundamental reality of ancient historiography. Once the Romans passed beyond the practical boundaries of Roman communication networks, they effectively disappeared from written history as Rome understood it. The Parthians kept their own records, of course, but these were written in languages Middle Persian, Parthian, Aramaic that few Romans could read. And most of these Parthian administrative documents have not survived to the present day. We are left with hints, suggestions, and fragmentary references that create an incomplete picture of what became of Crassus's lost legions. Some sources suggest that a significant number of prisoners were settled in the region of Margiana, located in what is now Turkmenistan in Central Asia. This made strategic sense from a Parthian perspective. Margiana sat on the far northeastern frontier of the empire, where Parthian territory bordered the lands controlled by various nomadic peoples, Scythians, Sakas, and other steppe warriors who periodically raided settled territories. The region required military garrisons capable of defending against these incursions. But deploying Parthian troops so far from the empire's core was expensive and logistically challenging. Settling foreign prisoners in frontier zones was a common practice in ancient empires. It placed potential troublemakers far from areas where they might cause problems while simultaneously providing garrison troops who had strong incentives to defend their new homes against external enemies. If the Romans were indeed settled in Margiana, their skills as soldiers and engineers would have been valuable assets. Roman legionaries were trained not just in combat but in construction. They built roads, fortifications, aqueducts, and other infrastructure wherever they campaigned. In a frontier region like Margiana, these skills could transform defensive capabilities. The sources hint that some of the captured Romans were put to work building fortifications using Roman engineering techniques, creating hybrid structures that combined Parthian architectural styles with Roman military engineering principles. But here the historical record takes a turn into genuine mystery, one that has fascinated and frustrated scholars for centuries. What happened to these Romans over the years and decades following their capture? Did they maintain their identity as Romans? Or were they gradually absorbed into the local populations of Central Asia? Did they preserve their military organization and fighting techniques? Or did these skills fade as the original prisoners aged and died without passing their knowledge to a new generation? The ancient sources provide no clear answers, only tantalizing hints and fragmentary references that raise more questions than they resolve. Cassius Dio mentions in passing that some Romans were employed in frontier service far in the east. But he provides no specifics about where exactly this service took place or what became of these men. Later Roman historians, writing centuries after Carrhae, occasionally reference the lost legions as a cautionary tale about the dangers of overconfidence and poor leadership. But none of them claim to have definite knowledge about the prisoners' ultimate fate. The silence is deafening. 10,000 men simply vanished from Roman consciousness, their stories untold, their descendants unknown. Modern historians have attempted to fill this gap through careful analysis of the limited evidence available. Archaeological excavations in Central Asia have occasionally turned up artifacts that suggest Roman presence or influence in regions far from where Romans should have been. Coins bearing Latin inscriptions, architectural features characteristic of Roman military construction, burial sites with grave goods that hint at Mediterranean origins. But these findings are scattered and ambiguous, open to multiple interpretations. And they have not provided a clear narrative of what happened to the Carrhae prisoners. One possibility is that the captured Romans served as mercenaries or garrison troops for the Parthians for a generation or so, before being gradually absorbed into local populations. Military skills would have been passed down to sons and perhaps grandsons, but by the third or fourth generation, the original Roman identity would have faded. The men would have married local women. There's no suggestion that the Parthians brought Roman women east for the prisoners, and their children would have been raised speaking Parthian languages, following local customs, worshipping local gods. Within a few generations, the descendants of Crassus's legionaries would have become indistinguishable from the general population of whatever region they inhabited. Another possibility, darker but perhaps more realistic, is that many of the prisoners simply did not survive long in captivity. The ancient world was brutal, and life expectancy for soldiers settled in frontier regions would have been low. Combat with nomadic raiders, disease, harsh environmental conditions, and the general hardships of life on the edge of empire would have taken a steady toll. The 10,000 who were marched east from Carrhae might have dwindled to a few thousand within a decade, to a few hundred within 2 decades, and to virtually nothing within a generation. Their disappearance from history might reflect the simple reality that they died far from home, leaving few if any descendants to carry their stories forward. Yet another strand of speculation, one that would gain considerable attention in the 20th century, suggests that some of the Roman prisoners might have been moved even further east, beyond Parthian territory entirely, into regions along the Silk Road trade routes or even as far as the borders of China. This theory, which we will examine in more detail in subsequent chapters, remains highly controversial among professional historians. But it speaks to something deeper than mere academic debate. It reflects a human need to believe that these lost men's stories did not simply end in anonymous death in some forgotten corner of Central Asia. For a man in his middle years or beyond, reading about the fate of these prisoners across the span of 2 millennia, there is perhaps a particular poignancy to their story. These were men who had followed their commander into disaster, who had survived the catastrophe of battle only to face a slower, more grinding form of destruction. They watched their numbers dwindle year by year, saw their hopes of rescue or return gradually extinguish, and ultimately faced the reality that they would die far from home. That their stories would not be told, that their sacrifices would not be remembered. They became ghosts in their own lifetimes, men who continued to exist but who had ceased to matter in the world they had known. The ancient sources preserve one final, haunting detail about the immediate aftermath of Carrhae. Plutarch records that when news of the disaster reached Rome, the city erupted in grief and recrimination. The Senate held emergency sessions. Political enemies of Crassus used the defeat to attack the triumvirate system. Marcus Tullius Cicero, the great orator, delivered speeches lamenting the loss of so many Roman lives. But notably absent from these Roman reactions was any serious discussion of mounting a rescue mission for the captured soldiers. The 10,000 prisoners were written off almost immediately. They were too far away, in too difficult a location, guarded by an enemy that had just demonstrated its military superiority. Rome mourned its dead and condemned Crassus's ambition, but it made no meaningful effort to recover its living sons from Parthian captivity. This abandonment must have been the final, crushing blow to the prisoners' morale. As they marched eastward into an uncertain future, they would have clung to the hope that Rome would come for them. That the republic they had served would not abandon them to permanent exile. But as months turned to years with no sign of Roman rescue attempts, that hope would have died. They would have realized that they had been forgotten, that their service and sacrifice meant nothing to the political leaders back in Rome. That they were now truly and completely alone. And so the prisoners of Carrhae disappeared into the vast expanses of Central Asia, into regions where Roman power did not reach and Roman historians did not venture. They became a blank page in history, a void that later generations would fill with speculation, legend, and increasingly fantastical theories about their ultimate fate. The mystery of what happened to them would outlive the Roman Republic, outlive the Roman Empire, and persist into the modern era as one of ancient history's most intriguing unsolved puzzles. But in 53 BCE, as the survivors of Rome's disaster stumbled eastward under Parthian guard, they could not have known they were becoming legends. They knew only exhaustion, despair, and the growing certainty that they would never see Rome again. The decades and centuries following the disaster at Carrhae witnessed the gradual transformation of historical fact into legend, of documented catastrophe into whispered mystery. As the 1st century BCE gave way to the Common Era, as the Roman Republic collapsed into civil war and emerged as the Roman Empire under Augustus, the story of Crassus's lost legions slowly mutated from a painful memory into something stranger and more elusive, a ghost story haunting the eastern frontiers of the known world. A rumor of Roman soldiers who had somehow survived, somehow persevered, somehow ended up in places so distant that they seemed to exist beyond the edge of the map. The Silk Road, that great arterial trade route connecting the Mediterranean world with Central Asia and ultimately China, served as the conduit for these stories. Merchants traveling eastward from Roman territory brought back tales heard in the caravanserais and market towns of Parthia, Bactria, and Sogdiana, stories of foreign soldiers who fought with unusual tactics, of settlements where people bore features suggesting Western ancestry, of military units that seemed to employ Roman-style formations in regions thousands of miles from where such knowledge should exist. These accounts were fragmentary, often contradictory, and impossible to verify, but they persisted with the stubborn tenacity of legend. By the early decades of the 1st century CE, Roman geographers and historians had begun to take note of these persistent rumors. Pliny the Elder, writing his encyclopedic natural history around 77 CE, makes passing reference to reports of Roman soldiers in the Far East. Though he treats these accounts with the skepticism of a serious scholar confronting unverifiable claims, Pliny had access to merchant accounts and diplomatic correspondence that provided him with information about distant regions. But even his relatively extensive sources could not confirm or definitively refute the stories about surviving remnants of Crassus's army. The most intriguing references come from an entirely different direction from Chinese historical chronicles that mention foreign military forces in ways that some scholars believe might refer to Roman soldiers. The Han Shu, or Book of Han, compiled in the 1st century CE by the historian Ban Jiyu, contains scattered references to various foreign peoples and their military capabilities. Among these references is a description of a people or settlement called Liqian, or Liqian. The precise transliteration from Classical Chinese varies among modern scholars. Located in what is now the Gansu corridor of western China, a strategic region that served as a critical junction on the Silk Road. The Han Chronicle describes encountering soldiers who used a distinctive defensive formation characterized as fish scale or fish scale formation, a description that caught the attention of later historians because it bears some resemblance to the testudo formation employed by Roman legionaries. The testudo, with its overlapping shields creating a protective shell, could conceivably be described as resembling fish scales by an observer unfamiliar with Roman military terminology, but attempting to convey the visual impression of the formation. The context of this reference involves Chinese military campaigns in Central Asia during the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE. The Han dynasty, under the aggressive expansionist policies of Emperor Wu and his successors, had pushed westward into the Tarim Basin and beyond, seeking to control the Silk Road trade routes and to counter the threat posed by various nomadic peoples, particularly the Xiongnu Confederation. In the course of these campaigns, Chinese forces encountered numerous different ethnic groups, military forces in service to various Central Asian kingdoms, and mercenary units drawn from across the known world. One specific incident recorded in the Han Chronicles describes a battle in 36 BCE, 17 years after Carrhae, at a fortification near the city of Jiji in what is now Kazakhstan. A Chinese army under the command of General Chen Tang laid siege to this fortress, which was held by forces loyal to a Xiongnu chieftain who had established an independent kingdom in the region. During the battle, the Chinese accounts specifically mention defenders who employed the fish scale formation, and who had constructed wooden palisades. Using techniques that seemed foreign to Central Asian construction methods, the connection to the lost Roman legions was not made immediately. For nearly 2,000 years, the Chinese references to Liqian soldiers and fish scale formations remained curious historical footnotes. Interesting primarily to specialists in Han Dynasty military history. But in the 1940s and 1950s, an American historian named Homer Hassenflug Dubs, working at Oxford University, began to examine these Chinese sources with a specific question in mind: could the soldiers described in the Han Chronicles actually have been survivors of Crassus's army or their descendants? Dubs published his theory in a series of academic articles and eventually in a book titled A Roman City in Ancient China 1957. Arguing that the timeline, geographic location, and tactical descriptions all aligned in ways that suggested at least the possibility of a Roman connection. His argument proceeded through several logical steps. First, the approximately 10,000 Roman prisoners taken at Carrhae in 53 BCE would have been marched eastward into Parthian territory, potentially as far as Margiana in modern Turkmenistan. Second, the Parthian Empire frequently employed foreign military units as mercenaries or garrison troops in frontier regions. Third, the political chaos in Central Asia during the 1st century BCE, particularly the conflicts between various nomadic groups and settled kingdoms, created a military marketplace where skilled soldiers could find employment with different rulers. Dubs theorized that some group of Romans or Roman-trained soldiers might have been employed by the Xiongnu chieftain Jiji, who was attempting to establish his own independent kingdom on the western edge of Xiongnu territory, far from the main center of Chinese power. When Chen Tang's Chinese army attacked Jiji's fortress in 36 BCE, these Roman soldiers would have been among the defenders, using their characteristic tactics and construction tactics and techniques unusual enough to warrant specific mention in the Chinese battle reports. Furthermore, Dubs noted that after the fall of Jiji's fortress, the Chinese accounts mention capturing and resettling the surviving defenders. He pointed to references in later Chinese administrative records to a settlement called Liqian, which some linguistic scholars suggested might be a Chinese transliteration of legion, or possibly of Alexandria, referring to one of the many cities founded by Alexander the Great in Central Asia. The location of this Liqian settlement, according to Tang Dynasty records, was in the Gansu corridor, specifically in an area near the modern town of Zalaijai. The Dubs hypothesis, as it came to be known in academic circles, generated considerable interest and controversy. Supporters pointed to various pieces of circumstantial evidence. The timeline worked 17 years between Carrhae and the battle at Jiji's fortress would allow for prisoners to be moved eastward, potentially sold or transferred between different rulers, and eventually end up in service to a Central Asian chieftain. The geographic locations aligned with known Silk Road routes and with regions where Parthian influence extended. The tactical descriptions, while not definitive, were at least consistent with Roman military practices. Moreover, some researchers noted intriguing cultural and archaeological hints. The region around Zalaijai in Gansu province contained local legends about ancestors who had come from the west. Though such legends are common throughout Central Asia and prove nothing by themselves. Some residents of the area were noted by early 20th century travelers to have physical features: lighter skin, occasionally lighter hair or eyes that suggested possible Western ancestry. Though again, Central Asia's position as a crossroads of multiple ethnic groups makes such observations ambiguous at best. Archaeological excavations in the region during the late 20th and early 21st centuries uncovered some tantalizing artifacts. Researchers found evidence of ancient fortifications that employed construction techniques somewhat unusual for the region. Some burial sites contained goods that might suggest Mediterranean origins, though the evidence was far from conclusive. Most intriguingly, some genetic studies of the local population identified Y chromosome markers that appeared with unusual frequency, and that some researchers associated with Mediterranean populations, though the interpretation of genetic data across such vast time scales and with so many potential sources of population mixture remains highly controversial. Critics of the Dubs hypothesis, however, raised numerous objections that have prevented the theory from gaining acceptance among most professional historians and archaeologists. The linguistic arguments were particularly weak. The connection between Liqian and either Legion or Alexandria required several intermediate transliterations and assumptions about how Chinese speakers would have rendered unfamiliar foreign words. The tactical descriptions were ambiguous. Many military forces throughout history have used formations of overlapping shields, and describing such a formation as resembling fish scales was not unique to Roman tactics. More fundamentally, critics pointed out that the theory required an extraordinary chain of circumstances, each of which was possible but none of which was documented. The Romans would have had to be moved from Parthian to Central Asian control, possible, but not documented. They would have had to maintain their military cohesion and tactical knowledge through at least one and possibly two generations, possible, but unlikely given the tendency of military units to fragment and assimilate over time. They would have had to end up specifically in service to Gigi, rather than any of the dozens of other rulers and warlords operating in Central Asia during this period, possible, but requiring a very specific set of circumstances. Perhaps most damning, there was the absence of material evidence that should exist if Romans had indeed reached China. Roman weapons, armor, coins, inscriptions, all of these were durable items that should have survived in the archaeological record if Romans had been present in significant numbers. Despite extensive excavations in the Gansu region and other areas along the Silk Road, no definitively Roman military equipment has been found in contexts that would support the Dubs hypothesis. The artifacts that have been discovered are ambiguous at best, open to multiple interpretations, and none of them provide the kind of clear, unambiguous evidence that would be needed to confirm such an extraordinary claim. By the early 21st century, most professional historians had concluded that the Dubs hypothesis, while fascinating and not entirely impossible, was probably incorrect. The more likely explanation for the Chinese references to unusual defensive formations and foreign soldiers was that the Han chroniclers were describing one of the many Central Asian or even Eastern Iranian military units that would have been commonplace in the region during this period. The fish scale formation might have been a Persian or Bactrian tactical innovation, or simply a Chinese description of something that looked unusual to them, but had no connection to Rome at all. Yet for all its probable falsity, the Dubs hypothesis captured something important about the enduring fascination with the lost legions of Carrhae. There is something deeply compelling about the idea that these vanished soldiers might have traveled further than anyone imagined, might have seen wonders that no other Romans witnessed, might have influenced cultures and histories far beyond their original mission. For men in middle age or beyond, particularly those who have faced their own disappointments and unexpected turns of fate, there is perhaps a resonance in the image of Roman soldiers adapting to circumstances impossibly far from anything they had known, making new lives in alien lands, persevering despite everything. The truth, almost certainly, is more prosaic and more tragic than the legend. The prisoners of Carrhae probably died within a generation or two of their capture, their skills and knowledge fading with them, their Descendants, if any, absorbed into local populations and losing any distinctive Roman identity within a few generations. They probably never reached China. They probably never influenced Chinese military tactics. They probably lived difficult, anonymous lives on some forgotten Parthian frontier before dying unmourned and unremembered. But the legend persists because it speaks to deeper human needs, the need to believe that nothing is truly lost, that even catastrophe can transform into adventure, that the man who marched into the desert seeking glory might have found something different but equally meaningful in the alien landscapes of Central Asia. The echoes in the East, whether real or imagined, remind us that history is full of gaps and silences. And that sometimes the most compelling stories are the ones we can never quite verify, the ones that exist in the tantalizing space between documented fact and wishful imagination. The lost legions of Carrhae wander still through these historical borderlands. Neither entirely present nor entirely absent, ghosts at the edge of what we can know. The story of Crassus's lost legions entered a new phase of inquiry in the mid-20th century, when the development of modern archaeological methods, genetic analysis techniques, and increasingly sophisticated approaches to ancient historiography allowed scholars to subject the legends and theories to unprecedented levels of scrutiny. What emerged from this examination was not a simple answer to the mystery of what happened to the 10,000 prisoners, but rather a more nuanced understanding of how historical fact transforms into myth, and how the gaps in our knowledge about the ancient world can become repositories for our own desires to find meaning in catastrophe. Homer Dubs's hypothesis, published in its most complete form in 1957, represented both the culmination of traditional historical speculation and the beginning of a more rigorous engagement with the question. Dubs was a serious scholar, a professor of Chinese history at Oxford University, and his work was grounded in careful reading of primary sources in both Latin and Classical Chinese. His proposal that survivors of Carrhae might have reached China and influenced Han Dynasty military practices was not mere fantasy, but a reasoned argument based on available evidence. However, as subsequent generations of scholars examined his claims with increasingly powerful analytical tools, the weaknesses in his argument became more apparent. The linguistic evidence, which formed a crucial part of Dubs's case, proved particularly problematic under closer examination. The connection between Liqian or Liqian and either legion or Alexandria required multiple intermediate transliterations and assumptions about how Chinese speakers in the 1st century BCE would have rendered unfamiliar Western terms. Linguists specializing in historical Chinese phonology pointed out that while such a connection was not impossible, it was far from the most likely explanation for the term. Other etymologies, rooted in Central Asian languages or even in Chinese itself, provided equally plausible alternatives that did not require the presence of Roman soldiers. Moreover, comparative studies of military tactics revealed that the fish scale formation, described in Chinese sources, was not uniquely Roman. Multiple military cultures throughout history have independently developed formations using overlapping shields for protection. Persian, Bactrian, and even some Central Asian nomadic forces employed similar tactics in various contexts. The Chinese chroniclers, encountering such a formation used by forces in service to the Xiongnu chieftain Jiji, would have described it in terms that made sense to them without necessarily implying Roman origins. The tactical description that Dubs had found so suggestive turned out to be less distinctive than he had believed. Archaeological investigations in the Gansu region, particularly around the modern town of Zalaijai, intensified during the 1990s and 2000s as Chinese archaeologists, sometimes working in collaboration with international teams, sought to resolve the question through material evidence. These excavations uncovered a complex picture of ancient settlement in the region, with clear evidence of Silk Road trade connections and cultural mixing between various populations. The findings included architectural remains, burial sites, and various artifacts that demonstrated the area's importance as a crossroads of civilizations. Some of these findings initially seemed promising for supporters of the Roman connection theory. Certain construction techniques in ancient fortifications appeared unusual for the region, leading some researchers to speculate about possible Western influence. However, closer analysis revealed that these techniques, while distinctive, could be explained through Persian or Bactrian architectural traditions that had spread throughout Central Asia. Following Alexander the Great's conquests 3 centuries before Carrhae, the architectural evidence, like the linguistic evidence, proved ambiguous, interesting but not definitive. The introduction of genetic analysis to the question in the late 20th and early 21st centuries represented a dramatic methodological shift. DNA studies offered the possibility of testing the hypothesis directly by examining whether the modern population of regions where Romans allegedly settled showed genetic markers consistent with Mediterranean ancestry. Several studies conducted between 2000 and 2010 sampled DNA from residents of Zalai and surrounding areas, looking for Y chromosome haplogroups and other markers that might indicate Western Eurasian origins. The results of these genetic studies were, like so much else connected to this mystery, intriguing but inconclusive. Some researchers reported finding elevated frequencies of certain Y chromosome haplogroups associated with Mediterranean and Western Eurasian populations. These findings generated considerable media attention, with headlines suggesting that genetic evidence had confirmed the presence of Romans in ancient China. However, the scientific community responded with appropriate caution. The haplogroups in question were not uniquely Roman or even uniquely Mediterranean, they were found throughout Western Eurasia and Central Asia. Their presence in Gansu could easily be explained by the region's position on the Silk Road and the centuries of population movement and genetic mixing that such a position entailed. Furthermore, geneticists pointed out the methodological difficulties in trying to trace specific population movements from over 2,000 years ago. The genetic landscape of any region is shaped by countless migrations, invasions, trade contacts, and individual movements over millennia. Isolating a signal from one specific group of people, such as hypothetical Roman legionaries, from this complex background noise approaches impossibility. Especially when the hypothetical source population Romans captured at Carrhae was itself drawn from diverse regions of the Mediterranean world, and would not have had a uniform genetic profile. A comprehensive 2010 study by geneticists from Fudan University in Shanghai, working with international collaborators, attempted to resolve the question definitively. They collected extensive DNA samples from the Zalai area and subjected them to detailed analysis using the most advanced techniques available at the time. Their conclusions were diplomatically worded but essentially negative. While the population showed evidence of genetic diversity and some markers suggesting Western Eurasian ancestry, these patterns were consistent with the region's known history as a Silk Road trading hub and did not require the hypothesis of Roman legionary settlement. The study noted that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that the genetic data, however interesting, did not meet that threshold. By the second decade of the 21st century, a scholarly consensus had emerged among professional historians and archaeologists. The consensus held that while the fate of the Carrhae prisoners remained uncertain due to gaps in the historical record, the specific hypothesis that they reached China and influenced Chinese military tactics was almost certainly false. The evidence that had seemed so compelling to Dubs and his supporters dissolved under closer examination into ambiguity and alternative explanations. The Legend of the Lost Roman Legion in China joined a long list of historical mysteries where the romantic answer turned out to be less likely than mundane alternatives. But scholarly consensus, while important, does not exhaust the significance of the story. The persistent fascination with Crassus's lost legions reflects deeper human needs and concerns that transcend questions of historical accuracy. The story has been retold in countless forms throughout the 20th and 21st centuries in popular histories. Novels, films, documentaries, and even video games. Each retelling emphasizes different aspects of the narrative, but common themes recur: the tragedy of ambitious men brought low by hubris, the horror of soldiers abandoned by their homeland, the possibility of survival and adaptation in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances. For contemporary audiences, particularly men in middle age or beyond, who have accumulated their own experiences of ambition, disappointment, and unexpected turns of fate, the story resonates on multiple levels. Crassus himself serves as a cautionary figure: a successful man who achieved wealth and power but remained unsatisfied, who sought glory in realms where his expertise did not apply, who ignored wise counsel in favor of his own flawed judgment, and who paid the ultimate price for his miscalculation. His tragedy is recognizable to anyone who has seen careers derailed by overconfidence, relationships destroyed by pride, or opportunities squandered through an inability to adapt to changed circumstances. The common soldiers present a different but equally powerful archetype: men who did their duty, followed orders, and found themselves betrayed not by their own failures, but by the failures of their leadership and by circumstances beyond their control. The image of these legionaries marching eastward into captivity, watching their numbers dwindle year by year, gradually realizing that rescue would never come and that they would die far from home. This narrative speaks to fears of abandonment and insignificance that haunt many lives. These men served Rome faithfully, but Rome did not save them. They became historical footnotes, their individual stories lost, their sacrifices barely remembered even by the civilization they had served. Yet the legend also offers a peculiar form of consolation. The persistent stories about survivors reaching China, founding settlements, passing their skills to new generations. These narratives suggest that even total disaster might contain seeds of unexpected possibility. Perhaps the legionaries who disappeared into Central Asia found new lives, new purposes, new meanings in their existence, even though they could never return home. Perhaps their disappearance from Roman history represents not annihilation but transformation, a passage into a different kind of existence that Roman chroniclers simply could not or would not document. Modern scholarship, in its careful dismantling of the more fantastic elements of the legend, has not killed the story, but rather clarified what we can know and what we cannot. The most likely fate of the Carrhae prisoners, based on available evidence and reasonable inference, is that they were employed as garrison troops on the Parthian frontier, probably in regions like Margiana, modern Turkmenistan, or possibly as far east as Bactria, modern Afghanistan. They would have served in this capacity for as long as their military skills remained valuable: perhaps a decade, perhaps 2 decades at most. They would have aged, suffered from the diseases and injuries that plagued ancient soldiers, and gradually died off without leaving clear traces in the historical record. Any children they fathered would have been raised in Central Asian cultures, speaking local languages, following local customs, and possessing at most dim memories of their father's origins. This prosaic conclusion, while historically more credible than romantic tales of legions reaching China, contains its own pathos. 10,000 men, professional soldiers who had trained for years in the Roman military system, who had mastered the sophisticated techniques of Roman warfare, who represented a significant investment of Rome's military and cultural Capital These men simply vanished into the vastness of Central Asia like water spilled on desert sand. Their skills died with them. Their stories went untold. Their sacrifices, such as they were, earned them no commemoration, no honored place in Rome's long roll of military heroes. Archaeological and historical research continues in the regions where the prisoners might have been settled. Excavations in Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, and Western China regularly uncover new evidence about the ancient world, and each new discovery offers the possibility, however remote, that some definitive trace of the Carrhae prisoners might finally emerge. Perhaps a burial site with clearly Roman military equipment will be found. Perhaps an inscription in Latin will turn up in some unexpected location. Perhaps some document preserved in an arid climate or a forgotten archive will provide the clarity that 2,000 years of speculation has failed to achieve. But even if such evidence never appears, the story of Crassus's lost legions will likely endure. It has transcended its origins as a historical mystery to become a meditation on larger themes, on the limits of power, on the consequences of hubris, on the fate of ordinary people caught up in elite ambitions, on the ways that history remembers some lives and forgets others, on the human capacity to survive and adapt, even in the most desperate circumstances, and on the gaps in our knowledge that we fill with hope, fear, and imagination. For the 45-year-old man or older, reflecting on this story in the 21st century, there may be a recognition that we are all, in some sense, potentially lost legionaries. We march through our lives following leaders whose judgment may be flawed, serving causes whose ultimate significance may be questionable, accumulating experiences that may or may not matter to anyone beyond ourselves. We face the possibility that our stories, like those of the Carrhae prisoners, might not be told, that our contributions might not be remembered, that we might disappear into the vast expanse of human history leaving barely a trace behind. Yet we persist, adapt, find meaning where we can, and hope that somewhere, somehow, our lives mattered, even if the record of that mattering has been lost to time. The lost legions of Carrhae, whether they died in Margiana or somehow reached the borders of China, whether they were forgotten within a generation or left descendants who carried forward some fragment of their heritage, represent more than a historical puzzle. They represent the human condition stripped of comforting illusions, the reality that most lives end in obscurity, that most sacrifices go unrecognized, that the vast majority of human experience dissolves into silence. But they also represent resilience, the stubborn refusal to vanish completely. The way that even fragmentary memories and ambiguous legends can keep the dead alive in imagination if not in documented fact. The echoes continue, faint but persistent, reminding us that every life contains stories worth telling, even when those stories can never be completely known.